What does Jacques Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis have to say about dreams? This is naturally an important topic. Dreams are a very crucial facet of any psychoanalytic treatment. But when we ask the question, what does Lacan have to say about dreams or dream interpretation, it seems we bump up against a bit of a wall. What is that? Well, in the history of psychoanalysis, if anyone has to say what is a Freudian dream interpretation, well, there's a lot to say. One can pick up one's copy of the 5th volume of the Standard Edition and the 4th volume of the Standard Edition, and there's a lot of material on how to interpret dreams, including the famous chapter 7, which breaks down multiple facets of the dream work. So that suggests that there must be quite a lot that Lacan has to say about dreams. Now, that's true. There's many comments on dreams and how to work with dreams that are scattered across Lacan's work, but we bump up against a problem here. Number one, Lacanian engagement with dreams offers something distinct and something different. So whereas you may have thought that a good Lacanian answer to the question of what is a Lacanian approach to dreams would be simply, well, a Lacanian approach to dreams is largely a Freudian approach. There's some truth in that. Obviously, Lacan, being the Freudian that he is going to use many of those concepts, many of those ideas. But the one problem with that answer is that it underestimates some of what is different about how Lacan wants to engage with and work with dreams. And note I keep on saying how Lacan wants to work with and engage dreams rather than stress the dimension of how Lacan wants to interpret dreams. So that's what this video and the following videos will try to do. Try to open up some perspectives of a distinctly Lacanian approach to dreams by looking at some concrete examples of how he does so. So having said that, let's think a little bit about the question, the quandary of interpretation. In many ways, you could say that Lacan is often referring to the Traumdeutung, sorry for the bad German pronunciation, the interpretation of dreams as a kind of text of psychoanalysis, as one of Freud's most crucial writings, as one of the most important inaugural moments within the history of psychoanalysis. You could also go so far as to say, which would be my interpretation, that when Lacan is saying things like the unconscious is structured like a language, one way of opening up that idea is precisely to look at the dream work mechanisms that Freud has discussed. So clearly this is material that is of huge significance for Lacan. But there is a but. And what's the but? The interpretation is the but. The book is called The Interpretation of Dreams, but there's certainly a very strong and considered approach that Lacan will present in the first couple of seminars and further on, that interpreting meaning on the behalf of the analyst interpreting the meaning of the analysand's dreams is a bit of a problem. Why? Because if the onus of the interpretive work is only on the analyst, that means that the analysand is not doing enough work or not doing enough analytical work. So that's one problem. The second problem is that, as anyone knows, as soon as you start telling me about a dream and I'm an analyst or a psychotherapist, I got a ton of thoughts, a ton of associations, and I'm tempted by the méconnaissance, the kind of imaginary temptation to say that's what the dream is about. In other words, what's problematic about an interpretation, even if it seems to be a good analytic interpretation, if it is an interpretation by way of meaning, it is an interpretation by way of the egoic meaning and understanding of the analyst. Maybe not always, but that certainly seems to be the risk it takes, that it's going to be an interpretation that goes via the ego of the analyst. Now, not only then does the analysand not get to do the analyzing of their own work, their own dream, but it also means that the work, as it were, stops. I have a question. A dream is a wonderful enigma. To give an answer is to put a full stop at the end of the dream. And of course, you can see where I'm going with that. If secondary revision, the narrativization of a dream, is a further way of disguising the dream, which of course is what Freud says, We could extend that argument to say that the elaborate imaginary involvement of the analyst themselves in interpreting a dream is simply a further defense of the dream, a defensive imaginary contribution rather than one that is adequately perplexing, than one that should pose a question. So you get the idea then that the predominant engagement of Lacan with many dreams is not so much to interpret them, to put a full stop at the end of what the dream might mean, certainly not to convey meaning, but to, in some respects, do the exact opposite. Now, if you are well versed in Lacanian theory or the history of Lacanian ideas, you may recall that some time ago, Jacques-Alain Millet and others announced the end of interpretation, which is kind of dramatic gesture. And of course, we could decide how we want to take that. But this is something that's very important to the Lacanian clinic. The end of interpretation, or the end, or certainly a critique or reconsideration of what many people in psychoanalysis would think is a kind of natural pairing, dreams and interpretation. From a Lacanian standpoint, we would want to couple or problematize or question that immediate conjunction, dreams and interpretation, and ask what else we can do with dreams, how else we can work with dreams. So here are two brief examples. Jean Alouche has a lovely book, unfortunately not translated into English, but it's a series of impromptu anecdotes of Lacan's clinical practice. One of them begins like this. Oh, Dr. Lacan, I have had a dream. I want to tell you. Thank you, that's enough for today. See you tomorrow. First one, sorry for the bad improv. Second one, this is one that has been related to me by a colleague. I haven't yet found the textual backup for it, so we'll have to do a little bit of research, but I think the basic underlying impetus of the anecdote is a good one and serves the general point. Octave Manoni is in analysis with Lacan. Things aren't going quite so well, it seems to be grinding to a halt. He's bringing dreams, but nothing seems to really be moving. And at one point in his frustration, Manoni addresses Lacan and says, well, what's going on? What do my dreams mean? And Lacan responds, yes, I know what they mean. Of course, I know what they mean, but I can't tell you. So in both of these instances, we've got not a response to a dream that says, in the first case, tell me more, or in the second case, well, here's an interpretation, but rather a kind of refusal to interpret, or indeed a kind of scansion, an abrupt halting, just when someone is starting to tell the dream. So what can we take from this? Well, our first obvious intuitive response would be to say, well, there's no interpretation happening. But if we think about that a little bit more, surely we could say that the interpretation is exactly taking the form of a refusal to interpret. Now that sounds like a suitably Lacanian paradox, but what's important about that idea? That an interpretation might take the form of a refusal to interpret. Well, one, if someone is cut off just as they're about to say, I have a dream. We know all about the Zeigarnik effect in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the idea that if you stop something at a kind of pregnant moment, just when something else is about to happen or to unfold, a musical melody, a scene in a film, that there is a kind of pressure, an impetus to complete it, to say more. You could then say, what better way to keep an interpretive movement, or to keep the unconscious working, than to do a kind of scansion, just when the dream is about to be told. So that is one response to the first example we thought about. In the second instance, to say to Manoni, if this isn't indeed apocryphal, I know what they mean, is to suggest that there is something significant and important, but that I'm not going to tell you what it is. In other words, that is a way of encouraging further dreaming. And maybe we could just make that point, that one way of working with dreams is simply to encourage the production of more dreams. Remember Freud's famous response to what is the idea of a successful interpretation? His idea is not so much that an interpretation has to be accurate, which is a kind of intuitive thought we may have, but more importantly, that the interpretation will enable more material to come out. A successful or effective interpretation elicits far more material. So to abruptly stop someone as they're about to tell a dream, or indeed to say, yes, there's meaning, but I'm not telling you what it is, both of those moments are an encouragement for the person to continue dreaming, or indeed for the person to kind of do some analysis themselves. So I'm starting to gesture a little bit towards the idea here, well, two ideas. One, that the analysis should try to open the unconscious, to put the unconscious to work, to keep it moving, number one. And number two, that you could say that by that very fact that one stimulates the unconscious, that one frustrates the analysand so they're trying to look more for an answer, it's not just to open the unconscious and to encourage the unconscious. You could then say, to use a formula that comes much later in Lacanian theory, that the unconscious will be set the task of its self-interpreting, of trying to think, of trying to process, of trying to respond to something that isn't being said. So that's our first key introductory note, that to say that dreams are something that are central to psychoanalysis and clinical psychoanalysis is absolutely true, but we may want to think a little bit about what it means to actually interpret the dreams. Let me just add one further thought to that. That is to say, one can work with dreams, one can even seemingly refuse dreams so much as one incites the process and underlines the importance of dreams, and that one extends this puzzling invitation to the analysand to carry on dreaming, to be frustrated with what the dream might mean. The last little caveat here to say is that that presumably will only work when there is a transference neurosis, when the person is already assuming that the analyst as a subject supposed to know something. So that will be important to thinking about how the dream could be incentivized, to put it in a rather silly way. Okay, so that's our opening series of comments. Let's now move to a crucial moment when Lacan is thinking about dreams. And we are going to focus a little bit on Seminar 2. And I was recently reminded by some colleagues at a conference that sometimes we think Seminar 1 and 2 are like basic, and now we got to go and do, exploration of Seminar 23. All I want to say about that is the early seminars are well worth returning to, even if you've read them, even if you think you've got what's there, because going back through them, you will undoubtedly find some material that is still challenging and that had potentially eluded you. So in Seminar 2, which is all about the ego in Freud's theory and in the technique of psychoanalysis, Lacan spends several sessions, at least two, talking all about the famous specimen dream of psychoanalysis, the kind of inaugural dream that Freud is so proud of and spends so much work on in the interpretation of dreams. And of course, I'm talking about the famous dream of Irma's injection. So we'll say a little bit about that dream, but I just wanted to position the dream in Lacan's sessions. So just prior to his discussion of, which I think is brilliant and enlightening for a number of reasons, but just prior to his discussion, and dare I say it, interpretation of the dream of Irma's injection, he's been discussing the problem of regression. Now, for many that are familiar with Lacanian psychoanalysis, we will be aware that Lacan's somewhat skeptical about this idea of this crude notion of regression taking us back to an earlier era of psychical life. It's almost as if regression involves a mini time machine back. He doesn't like that so much. He would rather have a sense of regression that is about regression understood in logical terms, or in terms of the three registers that he is also strongly propounding in both the early seminars and further on. So he takes issue with this diagram, which for many will be familiar. It's the diagram in the interpretation of dreams, and he kind of issues us a little challenge. He says, I think we need to understand regression more accurately. We need to specify it. We need to be more careful rather than how regression is often used. And it's a really good and important psychoanalytic point. I would suggest that whenever we're working with psychoanalytic language and we have a term which functions simply to do an explanation such that we don't have to interrogate that explanation, we can just simply say, well, that's regression and move on, that it's an assumption rather than being attentive to what needs to be explained or thought through in that situation, we should be a bit cautious. And I think Lacan's good like that. Rather than just saying, okay, it's regression here, let's see, is there another way of approaching this issue? So this is the famous diagram, and of course one of the ways that regression comes up in the interpretation of dreams is that Freud is trying to explain how in the course of sleeping the unconscious has a whole series access to a whole series of early memories, and also is having a visual experience. The sleeping subject is having a visual experience without waking up. So the idea is that there's a regression or a kind of reversal of the normal flow of perception. The normal flow of perception would be that there's stuff happening out there, I absorb it, some of it needs to be held in immediate pre-conscious awareness so that I can react and have a motor response immediately, but some of it filters down and kind of filters down into not just my pre-conscious but my unconscious. So that's the normal direction of conscious perceptual functioning. In dreams, it seems to go the other way around. You could say that there's an unconscious urge that is linked to something, a day's residue factor, something that's happened in the day, and there's an impetus that goes the other way around, from an unconscious impetus pushing through a whole series of memories as linked to, as hooked onto something which is of the day's residue and then experienced. So it's a kind of reversal. Now, full disclosure, I'm in awe of Freud's discussion about that. I think it's great, but nevertheless, to make the point, Lacan is not quite satisfied with this diagram, and he's not quite satisfied with that understanding of regression. So the point to make then is that in a series of seminars running up to this, Lacan gives us, what does he call it? He calls it play of writings. He juxtaposes a whole series of schemas from the project for scientific psychology, from the Traumdeutung, interpretation of dreams, and he includes some of his own, the well-known L schema, and he's trying to think about a better way of understanding repression. In other words, my argument here is that what Lacan is involved in is not just rethinking regression and not just coming up with a novel engagement with dreams, but also the challenge of schematization. What kind of schema would do a better job of trying to understand these things? So let me give you the quote. This is within the first page of the 13th session of Seminar 2, when he's about to embark on his rereading of The Dream of Irma's Injection. And he says this, in order to make it easier for you to shift from this schema of the psychic apparatus to that implied by later developments in Freud's thought, I'm going to propose to you a little test. And of course, the little test is how to rethink the whole, the little test is to think about Irma's injection and to see if there's another way of thinking about it. So to conclude, we have opened up a number of questions. We've asked, what is the Lacanian way of working with dreams? We've posed the quandaries, the challenges, the paradoxes of what interpretation might mean from a Lacanian standpoint when thinking about dreams. We've spoken about schematization, and we have tried to situate Lacan's rethinking of how we might approach dreams by locating it within Seminar 2. One last note about that. It's interesting, this is often forgotten. What immediately follows Irma's dream is a session called Odds and Evens. And Lacan very quickly moves to discuss the coin-tossing game that is mentioned in the seminar on the purloined letter, and then of course dives into the very famous and well-known seminar of the purloined letter, which there's a lot written about, people get all excited about. But it's not often remarked that seminar follows on, that session, or the series of sessions follows directly on after Irma's dream, and that Irma's dream, his engagement with Irma's dream, is itself following on from a challenge of schematization. So I'll leave you to think about what's going on with those juxtaposition of interests, but it seems an important question. So let's stop there.